What happens when a mighty republic suffers a defeat so catastrophic it seems the end of its world? When more than 100,000 lives vanish in a single day, when northern Italy trembles on the brink of collapse, and when an entire people is marching toward the gates of Rome. This is not just a story about a battle. It is the story of how Rome fell into despair at Arausio in 105 BC, only to rise again under the leadership of a new man named Gaius Marius. It is the story of how military reforms, political upheaval, and raw determination transformed a republic on the edge of extinction into a war machine capable of annihilating an entire migrating nation in one brutal day at Aquae Sextiae in 102 BC. On the 6th of October, 105 BC, the Roman Republic suffered what many ancient writers considered its worst military disaster. Near the town of Arausio, modern Orange in southern France, two Roman armies faced the migrating tribes of the Cimbri, Teutones, and their allies. The Roman commanders could not have been more different. Gnaeus Mallius Maximus, consul of the year, was a novus homo, a man of humble origins elevated by talent. Quintus Servilius Caepio, proconsul, was an aristocrat of ancient lineage who despised Maximus as socially inferior. Instead of uniting against the Germanic horde, the two men refused to cooperate. Caepio ignored Senate orders to obey Maximus. He camped his army separately, leaving a fatal gap. When the tribes attacked, the result was annihilation. Ancient estimates suggest up to 120,000 Roman soldiers and camp followers were slaughtered, an even greater loss than Hannibal had inflicted at Cannae a century earlier. Corpses littered the plain, wagons burned, and the Rhone ran red with blood. Rome's northern frontier lay defenseless. The political consequences were immediate. Caepio, blamed for arrogance and disobedience, was stripped of his wealth and eventually died in prison. But the damage went deeper. The Roman people lost faith in their ruling elite. Citizens whispered that the Republic itself might collapse. Northern Italy braced for invasion. Towns fortified their walls, farmers abandoned fields, and refugees streamed southward. The lesson was burned into Roman memory. Internal division was deadlier than any foreign enemy. For generations, Arausio became shorthand for disastrous leadership. Into this chaos stepped Gaius Marius, a man with no patrician ancestry. Born in Arpinum, a provincial town, he rose through talent and determination. He had already distinguished himself in the Jugothine War in North Africa, showing ruthlessness and efficiency. In 107 BC, despite aristocratic opposition, Marius was elected consul. He embodied a shift in Roman politics, the rise of men from the equestrian and provincial classes. He was a homo novus, a new man who owed nothing to the old senatorial families. When Arausio shattered the Republic, the Senate turned to Marius again. In 104 BC, he was re-elected consul and then re-elected repeatedly, breaking precedent. The Republic desperately needed stability, and Marius seemed the only man who could deliver. Marius recognized that Rome's old military system based on property-owning citizen farmers was broken. Arausio had not only killed tens of thousands of men, it had destroyed the manpower pool. His solution was revolutionary, recruiting the landless poor, capiti sensi. For the first time, Rome allowed men with no property to serve. The state would equip them, pay them, and reward them with land after service. Standardized equipment. Every legionary now carried the same weapons: the short gladius, the heavy pilum designed to bend on impact, the large rectangular scutum, and armor usually chainmail but sometimes bronze. Uniform helmets, greaves, and belts gave the legions a professional look. Daily training. Soldiers drilled in marching, entrenching, throwing pila, and close combat fighting. They became known as Marius's mules because they carried their own gear on long marches, building stamina and independence. Cohorts replace maniples. Instead of small, inflexible units, the army was reorganized into cohorts of about 480 men, flexible, self-sufficient, and easier to command. The Aquila, the eagle. Marius decreed that each legion would carry only one standard, a silver or bronze eagle. The eagle became the soul of the legion. To lose it was unthinkable. The The result was the birth of the professional Roman army. Soldiers were no longer farmers serving part-time. They were career warriors, loyal to their generals and trained to fight anywhere. But this reform came with a dangerous consequence. Soldiers would increasingly see themselves as loyal to Marius, Sulla, or Caesar rather than to the Senate. In saving the Republic, Marius also planted the seeds of its destruction. While Rome reformed, the Germanic tribes were still on the move. Ancient sources describe not merely armies, but entire peoples migrating southward. The Cimbri are thought to have come from the Jutland Peninsula of modern Denmark. The Teutones may have hailed from northern Germany. The Ambrones, another tribe, joined them along the way. This was not a disciplined invasion, but a wandering migration. Warriors marched with their wives, children, and elderly. Wagons creaked under supplies. Herds of cattle and flocks of sheep followed. Strabo writes of a rolling sea of humanity, hundreds of thousands strong. At Arausio they had shattered Rome. But instead of storming Italy immediately, they moved slowly, gathering allies and resources. For Rome this was a nightmare, an enemy that was both a military force and a moving society. Estimates suggest that with non-combatants included, the migrants numbered over 120,000. Wherever they went, they drained resources, disrupted local economies, and terrified communities. Villages emptied, trade routes broke down, and displaced Gauls pressed south toward Roman territory. Rome could not simply defeat them in battle, it had to think about the long-term survival of Italy itself. By 102 BC, the tribes had split. The Cimbri moved toward northern Italy, while the Teutones and Ambrones headed south through Gaul. Marius marched to intercept them. He chose his ground carefully near the thermal springs of Aquae Sextiae, modern Aix-en-Provence. The site was surrounded by hills, forests, and narrow valleys. Marius set his camp on high ground, forcing the enemy to attack uphill. He also concealed 3,000 picked soldiers in the wooded slopes, ready for ambush. Ancient sources hint at the psychological warfare Marius employed. He had his camp followers march visibly, inflating the appearance of his numbers. He drilled his men relentlessly, making them look calm and confident in sight of the enemy. The Teutones, flush with memories of Arausio, mocked the Romans. According to legend, they shouted to Marius's soldiers, asking if they had messages for their wives in Rome, since the Teutones would soon be visiting them. But Marius had prepared something very different. Before the main battle, Marius launched a night raid on the Teutonic camp. Roman soldiers stormed into the sleeping enemy's wagons, setting fires and sowing confusion. Ancient accounts, such as Valerius Maximus, record scenes of horror. Teutonic women, unwilling to be enslaved, took their own lives or killed their children. Wagons overturned, animals stampeded, and warriors scrambled to find weapons in the dark. By dawn, the Teutones were already shaken. Their cohesion was gone. They were marching not with confidence, but with rage and desperation, exactly the state Marius wanted them in when they met his disciplined legions. By midsummer of 102 BC, the stage was set. On one side, Marius and about 35,000 men, 6 legions, allied cavalry, and auxiliaries. They were disciplined, drilled, and armed with standardized Roman gear. On the other side, the Teutones, Ambrones, and their families. Ancient estimates vary wildly, but most suggest 100,000 or more fighting men, accompanied by tens of thousands of non-combatants. They had beaten Rome before. Why should this battle be any different? But numbers alone do not win wars. The Teutones were weighed down by wagons, herds, and families. Their warriors were fierce, but their army was also a traveling nation. The Romans, though outnumbered, were compact, professional, and prepared. Marius had chosen his battlefield deliberately, the slopes near Aquae Sextiae, with wooded hills and narrow valleys. The Teutones would have to fight uphill, their lines stretched and broken. The first clash came unexpectedly. As the Romans were gathering water from a stream, the Ambrones, a fierce tribe allied with the Teutones, suddenly attacked. Plutarch tells us the Ambrones rushed forward, shouting their own name. Ambrones! Ambrones! This was more than a battle cry. It was a declaration of identity. Their chant rolled across the valley like thunder, startling the Romans. Marius quickly ordered his Ligurian auxiliaries, who were nearby, to hold the line. What followed was a savage melee at the water's edge. Men slipped in mud and blood. Pila clashed against long spears. Shields splintered. But the disciplined Roman formation held. Soon legionaries reinforced the auxiliaries, pushing back the chanting Ambrones. The river became a graveyard, corpses floating downstream. The Ambrones' defeat was only a prelude. The Teutones were enraged. They prepared for a full assault. At dawn, the Teutones formed ranks and advanced uphill toward the Roman camp. From his high ground, Marius released a storm of pila. Thousands of heavy javelins arced through the air, smashing into shields, bending on impact and weighing them down. Warriors stumbled, unable to hurl the weapons back. Then came the Roman countercharge. Legionaries drew their short gladii, locked shields, and surged forward in disciplined lines. The Teutones fought with courage, but their charges lacked coordination. Individual warriors rushed ahead, leaving gaps. The Romans exploited every weakness, their cohorts pivoting and closing ranks with mechanical precision. Suddenly, the trap was sprung. From the woods behind the Teutonic line, 3,000 Roman soldiers burst forth. These were the troops Marius had hidden days earlier. They fell on the enemy's rear, slashing and stabbing, cutting down warriors who moments before thought they were safe. Panic rippled through the Teutones. Trapped between the uphill cohorts and the rear assault, their lines buckled. Some tried to turn and fight both directions at once. Others shouted to retreat. But there was no retreat. Roman cohorts on the flanks had already maneuvered to block the valleys and forest passes. The Teutones were caught in a tightening noose. What followed was not orderly combat but chaos and slaughter. Wagons overturned, blocking escape routes. Horses and cattle stampeded, trampling warriors and children alike. Warriors tried to flee into narrow ravines, only to be cut down or crushed by the weight of the crowd behind them. Streams overflowed with the bodies of drowning men. Ancient writers described the screams of women and children mingling with the clash of weapons. Many Teutonic women, rather than be enslaved, killed themselves or their families. In one tradition, women begged for mercy from the Romans, not for their lives, but to be accepted as priestesses. When refused, they committed mass suicide. This was not merely the defeat of an army, it was the collapse of a migrating people. Hour by hour, the Roman grip tightened. The front lines of legionaries drove steadily forward, stabbing with short swords, never breaking formation. The reserve cohorts plugged any gaps and pushed deeper into enemy ranks. The ambush force continued hacking from the rear, sowing panic. Teutonic warriors, so confident after Arausio, now looked around in disbelief. Their families wailed, their comrades fled, their chiefs could not rally them. Panic spread like wildfire. Groups broke and ran toward the hills, only to be funneled into Roman choke points. Some fought desperately to the last. Others threw down weapons in surrender. By sunset, the battlefield was a nightmare of corpses, broken wagons, and trampled livestock. Ancient sources claim over 100,000 Teutones were killed or captured. The Romans, in contrast, lost very few. The Romans spent days counting prisoners and spoils. The number of captives was so great that, according to Plutarch, slaves in Rome suddenly became cheap, flooding the markets. Among the captives were Teutonic women, who, when denied freedom, took their own lives en masse. Their story entered Roman legend as both a warning and a symbol of barbarian desperation. The victory was absolute. The Teutones, once a terrifying threat to Italy, were wiped from history in a single day. Their allies, the Ambrones, shared their fate. Rome rejoiced. The republic that had wept at Arausio now celebrated Marius as a savior. He was hailed as the third founder of Rome, after Romulus and Camillus. Citizens poured into the streets. Allies regained confidence, but glory has its shadows. Marius's soldiers were no longer citizen farmers returning home after victory. They were professionals, tied to him personally. They would follow him into politics, into future campaigns, and eventually into the civil wars that would destroy the Republic. Still, in 102 BC, none of that mattered. What mattered was that Rome had survived. The Germanic tide had been stopped. And yet, one great enemy remained, the Cimbri, marching toward Italy. The final reckoning would come 1 year later at Vercellae in 101 BC. The Battle of Aquae Sextiae was not just a military engagement, it was the annihilation of an entire people, the vindication of Marius's reforms, and a turning point in Roman history. From the ashes of Arausio rose the phoenix of Roman power, disciplined, professional, and unstoppable. But in that same fire, the seeds of political decay were sown. When news of the victory at Aquae Sextiae reached Rome, the city erupted in celebration. Only 3 years earlier, Arausio had nearly destroyed the Republic. Families still grieved sons and fathers lost in that disaster. Fear had hung like a storm cloud over Italy. Whispers of barbarian conquest filling the forums. Now, suddenly, the nightmare was gone. The Teutones who had mocked the Romans and threatened to visit their wives were no more. The Ambrones had been crushed. Farmers in northern Italy could return to their fields. Merchants could reopen trade routes. Refugees could go home. Rome's allies in Gaul and Italy, who had wavered after Arausio, now renewed their faith in Roman leadership. The Republic was once again the master of its destiny. Marius returned from Gaul not as a mere general but as a national hero. The people hailed him as the third founder of Rome, a savior who had preserved the state in its darkest hour. In the Roman imagination, there were 2 figures who had saved the city before: Romulus, the mythical founder, Marcus Furius Camillus, who had rescued Rome from the Gauls in 390 BC. Now Marius joined their ranks. He was granted multiple triumphs, parading prisoners and spoils through the streets of Rome. Ancient writers say the sight was astonishing: chains of towering Germanic warriors, strange wagons and weapons, and thousands of women and children destined for slavery. But the triumph was not merely material, it was psychological. The Republic had proven that it could fall to the depths of despair and rise again. Yet behind the celebrations lay grim realities. The slaughter at Aquae Sextiae was total. Ancient figures are exaggerated, but even conservative estimates suggest tens of thousands of Teutones and Ambrones died in a single day. Others were captured and sold into slavery. The Roman slave markets were suddenly flooded. Prices collapsed. Wealthy households acquired cheap servants, while poorer Romans could purchase slaves for the first time. The social consequences rippled across Italy. For the conquered, the tragedy was final. An entire people had ceased to exist as a distinct culture. Their songs, their traditions, their identity lost in the massacre and dispersal. In one sense, Aquae Sextiae was not just a Roman victory, it was the erasure of nations. One of the most haunting episodes of the aftermath concerns the Teutonic women. Valerius, Maximus, and other Roman sources describe how women, captured after the battle, begged to be admitted as priestesses in Roman temples rather than enslaved. When denied, they killed themselves, sometimes strangling their children first. Ancient accounts speak of mass suicides by hanging, of women fighting each other to the death rather than submit. Whether embellished or not, these stories reveal how the Romans framed their victory not only as military, but as cultural domination. The destruction of the Teutones was portrayed as total, down to the last woman and child. In Rome, Marius's prestige skyrocketed. He had been elected consul before, but after Aquae Sextiae his power was unmatched. He would be elected consul an unprecedented 7 times, but his very success began to destabilize the Republic. Why? Because the army that had saved Rome was no longer a citizen militia. It was a professional force, bound not by loyalty to the Senate but to Marius himself. Soldiers saw Marius as the man who gave them land, pay, and spoils. They were Marius's mules, his personal army. The precedent was dangerous. In the decades to come, other generals, Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, would use the same bond to turn legions against Rome itself. Thus, Aquae Sextiae stands at a paradoxical crossroads, a victory that saved the Republic in the short term but weakened it in the long term. The battle also reshaped the Roman economy and society. Land distribution. Veterans of Marius's legions expected rewards. Colonies were established in Gaul and Italy to provide land. This helped spread Roman influence, but also created tensions with local populations. Slave influx. Tens of thousands of new slaves altered labor markets. Some historians argue this contributed to the decline of free peasant farming in Italy, as cheap slave labor undercut smallholders. Class relations. By recruiting the poor, Marius had opened the army as a path of social mobility. Ambitious men from humble backgrounds could now rise through military service. But this also tied the fortunes of the poor directly to generals rather than the state. Even as Rome celebrated, the war was not over. The Cimbri, who had separated from the Teutones earlier, were still at large. They had crossed into northern Italy, threatening the Po Valley. In 101 BC, Marius and his colleague Quintus Lutatius Catulus would face them at Vercellae. That battle would complete the destruction of the northern tribes and secure Italy for generations. But Aquae Sextiae was the turning point. Without it, Rome might never have had the confidence or manpower to face the Cimbri. Military historians still marvel at Marius's tactics. He chose ground where the enemy had to attack uphill. He concealed an ambush force of 3,000 inches the woods, a classic use of surprise. He used camp followers to exaggerate the size of his army, undermining enemy morale. He drilled his soldiers to respond as a unit, making them far more cohesive than their opponents. Aquae Sextiae is often compared to Cannae in reverse. At Cannae, Rome was encircled and destroyed. At Aquae Sextiae, Rome encircled and destroyed its enemy. The contrast with Arausio is striking. At Arausio, arrogance and division led to disaster. At Aquae Sextiae, unity and discipline brought triumph. The memory of Arausio had scarred Rome deeply. At Aquae Sextiae, the Republic demonstrated that it had learned. Leadership mattered. Cooperation mattered. Discipline mattered. In this sense, the victory was not just military but moral. It proved that Rome could recover from even the greatest defeat, provided it reformed and united. Aquae Sextiae cannot be understood without the reforms that made it possible. Professionalization. Soldiers were career warriors. Standardization. Every legionary looked and fought the same. Cohorts. Flexible, reliable tactical units. The eagle, a symbol of unity and honor. These reforms would shape the Roman army for centuries. From Caesar's campaigns in Gaul to the legions that guarded Hadrian's wall, the system Marius created endured. But there was a darker legacy, the politicization of the army. When soldiers followed generals rather than the state, the door opened to civil wars. Marius himself would later clash with Sulla, unleashing violence in the streets of Rome. Caesar would eventually march his legions across the Rubicon, ending the Republic. In saving Rome from the Teutones, Marius had unintentionally paved the road to empire. The fate of the Teutones and Ambrones is a reminder that ancient warfare was often genocidal. Entire nations could vanish. After Aquae Sextiae, the Teutones disappear from history. They left no literature, no monuments, no legacy except in the pages of Roman historians who wrote of their destruction. For Rome, this was triumph. For the tribes, it was oblivion. In Roman culture, Aquae Sextiae became a symbol of resilience. Plays and poems celebrated Marius. Soldiers told tales of the battle for generations. The site itself, near modern Aix-en-Provence, remained associated with Roman victory. Yet in later centuries, as civil wars tore the Republic apart, some wondered if the price of that victory had been too high. By empowering generals like Marius, Rome had created a new kind of army, one that would no longer answer to the Senate. The arc from Arausio to Aquae Sextiae is one of the most dramatic in Roman history. At Arausio, Rome was humiliated, shattered, and nearly destroyed. At Aquae Sextiae, Rome rose from the ashes, annihilated its enemy, and regained its place as master of Italy. The victory was not just about weapons and numbers. It was about reform, leadership, and unity. It showed that Rome could learn, adapt, and overcome. But it also set the stage for the future. The Marian reforms that won Aquae Sextiae would ultimately undermine the Republic. The professional army, loyal to generals, would march not only against foreign enemies but against Rome itself. Thus, Aquae Sextiae is both triumph and tragedy. The day Rome wiped out a civilization in a single blow, and the day the seeds of its own downfall were sown. The story does not end here. 1 year later, in 101 BC, The Cimbri would meet Marius and Catullus at Vercellae. There, the last threat from the north would be destroyed. But that is another story, a story of Rome's final revenge, the climax of the Cimbrian War, and the crowning glory of Marius's career. Stay tuned, because history is never just about battles. It's about the choices leaders make, the reforms they pass, and the legacies they leave behind, sometimes glorious, sometimes fatal,